How many of you have forgotten all about that song? Did you know it? Yeah, you knew it, but we haven't sung it. In fact, Brenda said she doesn't remember singing that in a long, long time, and it wasn't in part of our, pardon? Your first time to hear it? Oh, well, see, there you go. Anybody else's first time to hear that song? There you go, another one back there. So it's just one of those things, but it fit with my message today. Actually, it goes in kind of a paradoxical arrangement with my sermon, if you will. We're going to be looking at, in fact, if I can get my clicker working here, I'm a little out of kilter. I haven't got everything all prepared. I'm still a little under the weather, so I won't be shaking hands today. But we're able to function anyway. Had to take a little break Wednesday night. That was odd. But step out the door, and after that, I at least was able to finish. Well, we're going to be looking at learning to pivot. Now, learning to pivot. Most of us, I think you know what that word has to do with. And sometimes you have to make a change. Sometimes during the day, you may have plans, and you've got to change. Something happens, and you've got to pivot. You've got to roll with whatever's going on. So it may make a difference. It may not with what you're doing. It may be daily. It may be that you've got a week. I had to pivot a little bit this week, and the fact that I went to bed Wednesday night. I didn't get back up again until Friday morning. I mean, that was it. I was out. So I had to pivot. I had to change my schedule a little bit on that. And that happens to us. There can be a lot more devastating things that happen to us, though, that cause us to have to pivot. And so this is just really kind of one of those sermons that hopefully can help us, encourage us to learn how to pivot. In fact, I will say that I think with all the things that have happened to our church in this last year, and we can go back a couple years to COVID and all that happened, we've had to learn how to pivot. We've had to learn how to change. And 2024, we may have more things that will cause us to have to learn how to pivot. So I did that song, I shall not be moved, because it was just an old one that got into my head, and I thought, that's a great one. You know, you think about it, the terms of Christians that we say like that, I shall not be moved, or, you know, we get real convicted about things, and, you know, I will fight to the death for my convictions. Baptist history, it's all we've got to do is read back that. A lot of Baptists died for their convictions. We have statements that will say, I'm set in my ways. My mind is set, and I will not change, or that is their mindset. All of these ideas are great, and they're said by strong-minded and strong-hearted people in certain situations in the Bible, but not in all situations. Paul states this, Peter confirms this, and the Holy Spirit mandates us that we need to learn to pivot. Be light on your feet. Learn to move. You got to adjust. That's what it is. We're going to look first at Noah's pivot. Noah had to pivot. By faith, we see it, and we'll go back into Genesis a little bit, but by faith, Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, pivoted. He moved with fear. He prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. He changed his whole life dynamic and the life of his family because of what God had called him to do, chose him to do. I believe that the Marines talk about and say that a Marine needs to learn to improvise, adapt, and overcome. Noah might have been the first Marine. He indeed had to learn how to adapt, improvise, and overcome. We often think about Noah and all of his work, but we sometimes don't think about the personal issue. What was he doing all up until that time? We know that he was engaged full-time building an ark. But for how long? Most people will talk about the fact that Noah probably was building the ark for 120 years. They use that because of Genesis 6:3, where the Lord said, "My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, for yet his days shall be 120 years." They say, okay, that's kind of the countdown until the flood is going to take place. That may well be. Do not know if that's accurate that way. I don't think it is actually. It's used so many times and said so many times that most take it for granted. How long, if I were to ask that question, how long did it take Noah to build the ark? Most people will just, without thinking too much, say 120 years. Well, could be. Others go back to Genesis chapter 5 and verse 32, where it says, "And Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth." They connect that then with Genesis chapter 7 and verse 6, where then it says, "And Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters were upon the earth." So some people will say, all right, he worked on it for 120 years. Some people will say, well, it was probably 100 years. Now, if that's the case, that may be as well. I'm not going to argue with many over that because I don't know exactly how long it was, and I'm going to say that most people really don't accurately know it either. Even Answers in Genesis comes up with an idea, and I like their investigation technique and how they get into it. And they bring up an interesting verse in chapter 6, verse 18, where it says, God talking to Noah says, "But with thee I will establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons and thy wife and thy sons' wives with thee." Now that would mean then that Noah's sons had to have been born. That means that Noah's sons had to have been married and had to have, more than likely anyway, they had these families that were all established. So they give the average idea that it's very likely that there was a span of 50 to 75 years that it took to build the ark. I'd say that's probably pretty accurate that way. In fact, I wouldn't have a problem with saying it was 50 years or even less. We do not know. People will say, well, they were ancient tools that they had. Again, go back and read. You have to remember, men lost a lot of their technology in the flood. They had to start all over again. But if you'll remember, there were already people working with copper and iron and so on that God tells us about. So there were no doubt there were tools that could help them along a lot further. Answers in Genesis, though they had huge equipment, that they had but they did a lot of the work by hand. That was there except for moving everything around. And it took them just 2 years to build the ark that they have there. And that's a full-size ark. However long it took him, it changed his life. It changed his family dynamic. He had to learn how to improvise, adapt, and overcome. He had to learn how to pivot. This was not just a life-changing event, this was a world-changing event. This changed all of mankind's history. We may be facing some events in the same way, with the wars in Israel and against China, Russia, seeing all these things coming about. It may be that we might see some life-changing, world-changing events. We know for a fact that God's judgment was going to fall upon the earth when God condemned the world for having imaginations that were evil only continually. And so therefore, everybody was going to get wiped out except for one family. One man and his family. Noah, being warned of God, pivoted. I can only imagine what Noah conceived of for his old age, whatever that was. Well, I have no concept of what he thought about old age. considering the fact that a lot of those guys lived to 900 years old, 700 to 900, and just living to 200, what a difference that would be. Well, where's your maturity? Where's your middle age? You're middle-aged when you're 350? My goodness. That's quite a difference. Well, maybe he thought about Mrs. Noah and all of his grandchildren and even his grandchildren's grandchildren running around his house or in the fields there that they could live with them. But God spoke to Noah. God called Noah. He commissioned Noah, and he covered Noah by putting him in the ark. And from that day forward, his life was different. And of course, so was everyone else's. This whole series of events changed him, his family, and as I said, his family dynamic. And even though they were rescued from death, that did not save them from the trials and the troubles and the tribulations that they were going to encounter. The exposure, though, of the providential hand of God made him change his plans. Well, a lot of times we make plans, but then we find out the providential hand of God changes those plans. And so we have to adapt. We have to pivot. We make plans and then we find that they are modified or even thrown out by God. And that's okay, because his plan is always best. The best, remember, is, when we're talking about that word best, the best plan is the plan that God comes up. It's the plan that God has in his eyes. He sees eternity. He is eternal. His judgment is perfect. So his plan is the best plan for us. So when we have to pivot, don't despair. I mean, can you imagine? No, I've got to build that. Man, this is going to be a long project. Even if it was just 50 years or 40 years or 30, that's a long project. That's a lot of work. Well, he had to pivot. Then we can look at and find, how about the Apostle Paul? Now, his whole life took a pivot on the Damascus Road, but that really was a radical change that God made in him. But if you follow him along, just after he was saved, he went back into the Damascus. He was going to preach to the disciples. And man, I mean, he just started a furor with the Jews. They did not want the Apostle Paul and his preaching. And so they plotted actually to kill him. In chapter 9, verse 23, it says the Jews took counsel to kill him. Once their plot was discovered, there was a pivot. Paul was taken by the disciples and let down by the wall at night in a basket. Afterwards, Paul headed toward Jerusalem. But it wasn't very long after he was there at Jerusalem, he had to learn to pivot there too, because of the Grecian Jews plotted to kill him. And Barnabas ended up taking him to Caesarea. And if we look there, chapter 9, verse 29 and 30, it says that he spake boldly in the name of the Lord Jesus and disputed against the Grecians, but they were about to slay him. And when the brethren knew, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him forth to Tarsus. See, Paul encountered troubles in abundance. We know that. Some of his troubles, and you think about it, were being scourged, stoned, shipwrecked, starved, imprisoned. That doesn't even consider all of his troubles that he really did encounter. Even the fact that there was a point in time when he thought that he and his team were going to die. They despaired, he said, even of life. He learned how to pivot. That's interesting, considering he also made this statement in Acts 20 and 24. When he was going to Jerusalem and they told him what was going on, he said, it doesn't matter. None of these things move me. Now, didn't I just say, here we are singing a song, I shall not be moved, and then I'm teaching you about having to pivot, and here's the Apostle Paul, I'm telling you, he had to learn how to pivot, and then here he is saying, but none of these things move me. Neither count my life dear unto myself, so I might finish my course with joy, and the ministry which I have received of the Lord Jesus to testify the gospel of the grace of God. He knew the path that God had set his feet on from the very beginning. He was told where he would preach, who he would preach to, and what he would preach. From that course, he never changed. He never made a pivot from that course. But as he was on that course, God would cause him to move locations, just like the Macedonian call. He had to pivot. He had to change. His course was changed time and again since the God changed his eternal course on the road to Damascus. Paul even said he learned how to pivot. In Philippians chapter 4 and 11, I'm going to show you verses 12 and 13, but in Philippians 4 and 11, Spurgeon, when Paul had talked about I've learned therewith to be content, he said those words learn means to be initiated among those who are content with such things. Christians learn to be content with things of the Lord. I'm joining the ranks of those kind of people. His initiation was into the school of divine providence, and here's what he wrote about it to the church at Philippi. I know both how to be abased, and I know how to abound. He pivoted from one to the other. I know I can pivot to be abounding, other times abased, humiliated. And in everywhere and in all things I'm instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengtheneth me, or which strengtheneth me. There is how he learned how to pivot. You see, when we look at that, we know how to abound, how to be abased, all of those things that Paul gave to us. It is the Christian school that everyone enters. If you're saved, you're going to enter that same school. It's the school that every Christian attends. Paul knew that God had a path for him to follow, and it seemed to change in such drastic ways. But he learned, again, how to be abased, how to abound, how to be in drought, and how to be in abundance. And he did so through the strength of Jesus Christ. Even when he thought, you know, Lord, if you just get rid of this thorn in the flesh, I'd be all right. I'd be more successful. The Lord said, no, Paul, you need to learn to pivot. You need to depend upon my grace. And then he said, you know what? I have learned that it is in my weakness that I'm made strong. He learned how to pivot. We only change temporal plans when we begin to see the hand and understand the hand, the providential hand of God. But we must be careful that we do not misinterpret events. I've seen and heard a lot of people who interpret events and say, well, I can see, I know this is what I'm supposed to do, and 2 years down the road, they're not doing that anymore. What happened? We misinterpret the providential hand of God. Now, I've seen it so many times that I won't even begin to talk too much about it, but the fact is that a lot of people do misinterpret the providence of God. What a wonderful work of grace that we can experience in our life, that we can do all things through Christ. If this year demands that we pivot, we have the strength of Christ to help us to do so. We don't need to fear the future. We don't need to fear what 2024 holds for us. Let me give you another one with a fellow by the name of Joseph. Joseph's pivot. Where was that? Well, he makes mention of it in Genesis 50 and 20, but it was experienced years before this, where he said that when his brothers were afraid that he was going to kill them, he said, no, but as for you, you thought evil against me when you sold me into slavery, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. Now, God always had a course for Joseph. But his temporal plan, I cannot imagine. Even with the dream that he had of his brothers, I cannot imagine that he could ever interpret that dream like what he experienced in Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20. God had a plan. I don't know how quickly he recognized that providential hand of God, but he certainly told his brothers about it years later. He learned to pivot because he saw the providential hand of God in his life and in those around him. Even those who did not know God as he did, he was aware that God was working out a plan. Remember, when you think about it, it wasn't just saving much people alive here, but there's some other events. God had a plan for Joseph, but he wasn't aware. He was raised up into a high position within the Pharaoh's plans, but I think that something happened along the way. That what happened? All of a sudden, he was in prison. How did he find himself in prison? He had to pivot. He had to change. I realize it was the prison for the people who worked for the king, but nonetheless, it was a prison. He was held captive. He changed. He learned how to pivot. Let me go on, because I see I'm running out of time quickly. Daniel's pivot. Remember this young man. A man that was young, intelligent, involved in leadership. You know him as Daniel. He had other young friends that were with him. And one day, what happened was Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, sieged Jerusalem, and they took captives. And here in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 3, we see it, and the king spake unto Ephanes, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning and knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Daniel's whole life was changed. He had to learn how to pivot. He had a number of pivots, in fact, if you look through his life. One day, he had to make another pivot after he was again elevated into such a high position with the kingdom. The other leaders were jealous of him and sold him out. They created some laws. They entrapped him with the Medes and the Persians, and they knew the king couldn't get him out of it. What happened? He pivoted right into the lion's den. Then the presidents and the princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion for fault, as for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. So they had to make up stuff to get him. That's politics, isn't it? It's just what we see going on a lot of times. They got the king to set a new law, a law they knew Daniel, because he could not be moved from his convictions, that he would break that law because he would never break God's law. And what happened? When Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before God as he did aforetime. He would not be moved from honoring God. But he did learn how to pivot, because what happened? He was pivoted right into the lion's den. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, and I love this, thy God whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. This man had faith in Daniel's God. Isn't that amazing? Those lions were hungry. They were kept hungry on purpose. But look what happened. He made a pivot, and instead of being fearful, we all sing a song about Daniel making one of the lions his pillow. We see in verse 22, my God hath sent his angel and hath shut the lion's mouth, that they have not hurt me, for as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, I have done no hurt. He learned how to adapt, improvise, and overcome. He had the temporal challenges that were before him. If you ever remember, too, there were some other men who were against him, all of those leaders. They and all of their families were thrown into that lion's pit. They were destroyed. So, my title, looking again at not only Joseph, but Daniel's pivot, kind of go back to that verse, takes me back into where Paul said, but none of these things move me. We have a course that God has set for us. From that we will not be moved. But how we achieve that, we may have to make some adaptations. We may have to make some changes. We may have to learn how to pivot. We've already seen how life-altering changes can take place around us in short order. We've all had to make changes in our lives over the last 3 years. It may be that even the course of this world, our nation, or even our communities are coming up to a radical change. You ever see what laws, again, our state of California has changed? And what they are instituting now? It's very sad. They are changing, and we need to learn how to pivot, accept the change, but continue the course that God put us on. And let me end again with this. Nevertheless, whereto we have already attained. Where we've already gotten to. Where God has led us up to this point. Let's not forget where we've gotten to. And then 2 admonitions. Walk by the same rule and mind the same thing. Walk by the same rule. That's not going to change. Our rule of faith and practice, the Bible is our rule of faith and practice. That will not change. From that we will not pivot. From that we will not need to adapt. Minding the same thing. Here's where we may find some room to pivot. Because what do? Mind the same thing? You ought to love one another. You're supposed to be edifying one another, encouraging one another. And there are ways in which we can better learn how to do that. We don't pivot from the things that God has directed us to, but you will be a lot happier. You will enjoy 2024 a lot better. You will have a greater spirit of praise and thanksgiving, even if it was having to go through a flood, even if it was having to go through a stoning and being dragged out of town and your mission direction changed, even though you might be sold into slavery, even though you could be taken a political captive, there's your pivot points. Whatever experience we may have to go through this year, we can pivot because we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. I pray the Lord has been a blessing.